many thanks to Mr. Meadow, Mr. Phil Merwin, Dr. Sheila Zaretsky, Brett Kramer, and of course my wife Roberta and my daughter Sarah. Tonight we have with us Dr. Robert Marshall, who has been a teacher, an analyst, and supervisor here for many years. He has written numerous articles and 2 books. One of the books, The Resistant Interaction, has been published now in Japanese. And he wrote a book with his wife, Dr. Simone Marshall, Transference and Countertransference Matrix. He wrote a very moving and thorough introduction to the journal's publication of Dr. Margolis' selected papers. And there's an article now in the current journal's Modern Psychoanalysis entitled A Dynamic and Structural Model of the Triad of Supervision. He has completed an article accepted for publication on COVID and Spotnitz, and is currently writing a paper discussing Ferenczi and Spotnitz. Dr. Marshall has strong roots with Ferenczi. He is a member of the board of the Ferenczi Institute, and he is co-editor of the newsletter of the Ferenczi Institute. He has returned from Hungary, where he had a journey with his wife, Dr. Simone Marshall, following the footsteps of Ferenczi. After Dr. Marshall's talk, we'll hear brief comments by 2 distinguished discussants, Dr. Simone Marshall, a graduate from the William Allison White Institute, and from Dr. Nicole Kirman, a well-known and well-loved member of the faculty of CMPS. Afterwards, all of you are invited to ask questions and to make comments. My father was fond of using an ancient Greek saying to always combine that which is good with that which is pleasant and entertaining. Well, tonight we're fortunate because Dr. Marshall is a master of this combination. So I invite you to relax and to let Dr. Marshall do his magic on us for an edifying and enjoyable evening. Let us all follow the steps of Dr. Marshall.
Thank you very much for a gracious introduction, Phil, and also thanks very much for your diligence in putting this conference together. It wasn't easy. I'd like to welcome all CMPS, faculty, students, family, friends, and a special invitation to Hungarian friends and fellow travelers. Just in time, yo estat serata gestutum unicet. Not many Hungarians in this crowd. I thought he was.
I'm a Hungarian. Would you translate that for us? I can share your own.
That's master. When I was a youngster, I was entranced with a radio program called Let's Pretend. Very few people know it. A couple. And the child within me reaches out to the child in you to join me in a make-believe conversation between a modern psychoanalyst and Sandor Ferenczi. Sandor. Dr. Nicole Kirman has graciously agreed to be the modern analyst, and I will take the role of Sandor Ferenczi, but I'll spare you the Hungarian accent.
Hello, Dr. Ferenczi. I understand that you wanted a consultation with the modern analyst.
Yes, when I died in 1933, God, who is a Freudian, banished me to psychoanalytic hell. Recently, she began to read some modern psychoanalytic material and has graduated me to limbo. In order to get to heaven, I have to be analyzed to find out who is the real Sandor Ferenczi and present that person to the world.
What can I do for you today?
You can help me tell the story of my life.
How How are we allowed to help you?
I just need your help to tell the story of my life to the world, to clear my name.
When would you like to begin?
Right now. I was born on July 7th, 1873, in Mishkol. How's that, Dr. Brockman? Does that sound right? Mishkol, which is an industrial city of about 60,000 persons, about 40 miles northeast of Budapest. Let me go back and say, Yo estat, Dr. Galdi. My father, who was born Baruch Franco in Krakow, moved to Hungary to fight the Habsburgs when he was 18. He was quite an intellectual and revolutionary and wanted to be assimilated into the Hungarian culture so much that he changed his name to Bernard Ferenczi, which is a pretty common Hungarian name. He owned a printing press, and more so a bookstore where artists, musicians, and authors used to congregate. Unfortunately, he died when I was 15 years old. According to my sister, I was my father's favorite child.
You had brothers and sisters?
Yes, I was the 8th of 12 children and the 5th of 6 sons.
Should I ask about your mother?
Now is as good a time as any. She was born Rosa Ivanschutz, also from a Polish family from Krakow that settled in Vienna. She was a very efficient householder, helped my father in his endeavors, and also was president of the local union of Jewish women. After my father died, she capably took care of the bookstore, all of the children, and entertained the intellectual community. I wrote to Grodek. It is certain that as a child, I received from her too little love and too much rigor. Sentimentality and caresses were unknown in my family, and feelings such as modesty and respect toward the parents were jealously cultivated. On my 24th birthday, I wrote the following poem to my mother. At the edge of a new life, I salute you, my mother. Only you, no one else can understand when I cry. And today I shed warm tears, real tears, earnest tears. My 24 years are lying here in the coffin. I was always open about my needs for love and affection from her and others. But let's talk about something else.
What would you like to talk about?
My education and training. I was always a good student, and even though I didn't apply myself vigorously to my studies in high school and college, I always got the best of grades. I had wide-ranging interests in politics, psychology, law, and literature, and had a good time in the cafes in Budapest discussing these topics. Although I felt somewhat shy, people found me witty, enthusiastic, friendly, with a restless curiosity. I began to study medicine in 1890, when I was 17 years old. I was interested in hypnosis, the occult, thought transference, and hysteria. After I served my compulsory year in the military, I interned and trained in various hospitals in Budapest, where I studied neurology and neuropsychiatry. I found myself treating patients who were deemed to be incurable by the prevailing nosology. In fact, in 1902, I treated Rosa K., a female homosexual who was a transvestite and prostitute. Mainly, I wanted to understand this person who had been so unwanted and neglected and literally had no place to go. As part of trying to understand her, I had her write her autobiography. As I discussed her case, I preferred to cast out pejorative terms implying perversion and depravity and substituted terms that meant inversion. Prior to meeting Freud, I had written about 60 professional papers.
When and how did Freud enter your working life?
Well, I was accustomed to reading psychoanalytic literature and was taken by Jung's free association technique such that I plagued friends, relatives, and colleagues with it. When I first read Freud's theory about the sexual trauma etiology of neurosis, I felt displeasure and aversion. Shortly thereafter, I realized that my emotional reaction suggested that there was some element of truth to Freud's ideas. And when I reviewed the interpretation of dreams, I deemed it unscientific and paid little attention to it. However, in February 1907, a mutual acquaintance urged me to meet Freud. We were immediately attracted to each other. Even Jones remarked the effect was electric. Freud, in writing me, would address me as my dear son. That summer, I was invited to spend a fortnight with his family at Berchtesgaden. Freud also wanted me to marry his eldest daughter, Matilda. In 1909, Freud invited me to accompany him, Jones, and Jung to the United States, where he was to deliver 5 lectures at Clark University. And when you had your conference in Worcester, perhaps you sensed me peeking over Dr. Meadows' shoulder, giving her encouragement to explain the use of countertransference. In the morning, prior to his lectures, Freud and I would walk together in front of the university building. He would ask me to suggest what he should talk about that day. I gave him a sketch, upon which he improvised in his lecture. Contrary to Freud, I liked him and returned several times. We continued to travel, work, and vacation together. We even consulted a clairvoyant together. I was his closest and most trusted friend since his relationship with Fleece, such that in 1910, Freud asked me to establish the International Psychoanalytic Society. However, on a summer trip to Sicily, we had our first spat. I understood that we were going to collaborate in writing up the Schreber case. However, on the first night of our work, he surprised me by ordering me to take his dictation. When I objected, he accused me of wanting to take over. I believe that this outburst was precipitated by my wishes for closeness, his fear of our mutual analyses, and especially my wanting to know more about his relationship to Fleece. I probably invaded his sense of privacy and remobilized his homosexual fears, which he confirmed in a letter of October of 1910. Basically told me to back off and, quote, turn attention to the present. And by the present, Freud meant the development of clinical psychoanalysis. Yearning for Freud's approval, I became the submissive son and applied myself assiduously to expanding psychoanalytic theory and technique. I established the Hungarian Psychoanalytic Society in 1913, whose vigor impressed Freud. At the same time, I became a member of the Committee of Ring Holders. In 1914, I became one of the first to undergo a personal analysis as part of one's training as an analyst. I was analyzed for 3 weeks in 1914, but the war interrupted our sessions. We continued twice-a-day sessions for 3 weeks in 1960 in Vienna, where Freud insisted that I have at least one meal with his family, 1 meal a day with his family. But at the same time, warned against any personal talk. Freud also visited me for a few days in Papa during my military service. Now, I'm unclear whether or not any analysis was conducted there. Freud considered that the analysis was complete, successful, but not terminated.
Did you consider the analysis complete and successful?
Not at all. When I reproached Freud about my dissatisfactions, he attributed my feelings to transference. He always had an excuse for not continuing the analysis and discouraged my own attempts at self-analysis. The incomplete analysis smoldered within me and perhaps hastened my death. I felt terribly confused. On one hand, he was grooming me to be his successor, but would not analyze me. That child within me was unwanted and forgotten by him and me. Despite my feelings, I still held Freud in admiration, and I contributed mightily to the movement with Freud's outspoken encouragement. It was his wish that the capital of psychoanalysis be outside of Vienna. In 1918, it seemed that we would realize that dream with the immensely festive and successful Budapest Congress. I became the first ever university professor in psychoanalysis at the University of Budapest. Moreover, in a 1919 paper, Freud informally passed the mantle of psychoanalysis to me by writing. Developments in our therapy, therefore, will no doubt proceed along other levels. First and foremost, along the one which Ferenczi, in his paper, Technical Difficulties in an Analysis of Hysteria, has lately termed activity on the part of the analyst. He even called me his secret grand, how do you pronounce that word? Secret vizier, which means basically prime minister, psychoanalysis. By installing me as heir apparent to the throne, Freud put me in the middle of a two-way speedway. On one hand, I was swept along with Freud's enthusiastic approval of me, but I was fiercely opposed by Jones, Abraham, and Glover, under the guise of protecting tradition. Although I don't like to use ad hominem arguments, I suspect they were envious of my relationship with Freud, and sometimes I thought they were acting out some level of Freud's wishes. Although we worked together very well, I sometimes felt a rift between Freud and myself, especially when he characterized patients as riffraff or dreck, and talked of his aversion to regression and psychosis. Where he thought some patients were incurable, I thought perhaps we had not yet discovered the right method. Two other events transpired which helped determine my future. In 1925, I teamed up with Otto Rank to write the developmental aims of psychoanalysis. My main aim was to point out that psychoanalytic technique was evolving into a dry, intellectual reconstruction of the past and had begun to miss the emotional component, which was being manifested in the transference, or as you put it, in the here and now. I was happy to see that recently the New York Psychoanalytic Society devoted one of our meetings to discussing our book. Jones and Abraham would have no part of this supposedly heretical direction, and expressed their concern to Freud, who in turn cautiously reserved judgment and wrote to us, me, that you or Ronk should in your independent flights ever leave the ground of psychoanalysis seems to me out of the question. Why shouldn't you have the right to try if things will work in another way from that I had thought? The other important event was an 8-month visit to the United States in 1926-27, where I lectured at the New School, the New York Psychoanalytic Society, and St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington. I also conducted several analyses and trained some lay analysts, despite the objections of the New York Psychoanalytic Group. Perhaps the most significant upshot of the trip was that I gained the attention of Harry Stack Sullivan, who subsequently prevailed upon Clara Thompson to study with me. As you probably know, she stayed with me to the end as student, supervisee, and analysis. Upon her return to America, Clara helped found the Interpersonal School and was the first director of the William Melanson White Institute for many years. Again, Jones pathologized my actions. He saw my visit to America as regression. That was his code word for psychosis. These were years of turmoil and confusion for me. On one hand, I wanted to remain within the Freudian province, and I knew I had Freud's personal blessing to develop psychoanalytic technique. For example, in 1928, Freud wrote a very encouraging letter about my elasticity paper and urged me to keep writing. More and more patients were coming to me, especially those who had been in failed analyses for several years and with different analysts. I was finding success with them. Patients whom you would diagnose as borderline and narcissistic. I was known as the analyst of last resort. I noticed that some of my writings were not reflecting my real ideas and practice, but was some kind of tepid compromise with the mainstream. On the other hand, I knew that Jones and company were calling me a heretic and a deviationist. That was a kiss of death. And were getting Freud's ear. What was I to do?
And what did you do?
I followed my clinical judgment and hoped that Freud would approve. Freud finally scolded me in his famous kissing letter of December 31. Under certain circumstances, I did allow some kissing and hugging as part of providing patients with the affection that they never had received from their own mothers. Like a naive child, I did not recognize the erotic element in these physical indulgences until I found out, for example, that Clara Thompson was mischievously going about even to Freud, saying she could kiss me whenever she wanted. In many respects, I considered a kiss and a hug in the Hungarian culture the equivalent of a handshake in Vienna. At any rate, Freud came down hard with the question that Spotnitz uses: why stop at a kiss? But then I remembered that Freud fed some of his patients, gave them money, took walks with them during analytic sessions, gave them gifts, gossip, and arranged for free treatment of the Wolfman. I recall the indulgences that Freud granted me as an analyst. I recall that he analyzed his daughter, and Melanie Klein, her son. But Freud always maintained that he could compartmentalize his therapeutic work from social intercourse. But I think after his own close escapes, Jung's affair with Sabrina Spielrein, Jones's affairs, and my infatuation with my fiance's daughter, Freud tightened reins. Another aspect to this era is that I found my active techniques, which were based on Freud's concept of abstinence, led to a mobilization of frustration and hostility that damaged the treatment. Given the mixed results of active techniques, I evolved techniques which did contain measures which would gratify unfulfilled wishes for love. As I sensed the chronically frustrated needs for love and understanding of my patients, I knew that interpreting and attributing the past to fantasy or re-traumatizing the patient, I was struggling to evolve a theory and techniques to treat those patients who had suffered pre-verbal trauma. I knew that it was important to retrieve that and talk with that forgotten and unwanted child. I think the best part of my efforts, and which I see containing in modern psychoanalytic practice, is what I call empathy. That is, I use myself to experience the feelings and conflicts of my patients. Racker eventually called this concordant identification, and Winnicott and Spotnitz called this objective countertransference. This may seem old hat to you, but I'd like you to experience my dilemma of 70 years ago. But I guess that Dr. Spotnitz shared some of these feelings when he was faced with the disapproval of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute when he was experimenting and finding success in treating schizophrenics.
Should I be saying something?
Not yet. Let me go on. I was becoming persona non grata in the psychoanalytic world. In retrospect, I was overextending my ideas about sincerity and dramatic living. My European colleagues were avoiding me, and none publicly came to my support save Clara Thompson. Even James Balin, one of my closest students, did not dare support me publicly for years after my death. Also, Jones's attacks on me were mounting. He saw each innovation as a regression.
What did Jones have against you?
What did Jones have against me? Well, you have to remember that Jones devoted his life to Freud, but never received the personal acknowledgement that I did. Moreover, when Jones asked Freud to analyze him, Freud turned him down and sent Jones to me. But I could never analyze Jones's hurt and anger toward Freud for that and many other things. But I believe Jones acted out his repressed rage on me. The actual break between Freud and myself occurred around the Confusion of Tongues paper, which Freud asked me not to present at the Wiesbaden conference in 1932. Freud was too ill to attend, but the word was already out, so that the response was manifestly negative. In fact, it was banned for publication until 1949.
What was so controversial?
What was so controversial? Well, I reintroduced Freud's original seduction theory because my research informed me that my difficult patients were in fact sexually or emotionally, physically traumatized. I felt vindicated recently when I saw a report that suggested that 1/4 of the population has been sexually molested. With the traumatized patient, I found that resorting to interpretations and implying that the trauma was fantasy simply devastated the patient. I determined that the child wants love and tenderness and acceptance, but when subjected to the unbridled passions of the parent, the child becomes confused and literally tongue-tied. Children know the truth before they know the meaning of words. After they learn the meaning of words, they become confused. When the parent in a seductive or abusive mode tells the child, I'm doing this for your own good, or because I really love you, the child becomes confused, anxious, guilty, and develops defenses against these affects. In effect, the child is in a double bind, which was made famous by Gregory Bateson. In this paper, I also introduced the dynamic of the child's introjection of the parents, the abusing parents' guilt and badness, hence contributing to the self-blame and pathological defenses, and in modern psychoanalytic terms, contributing to the narcissistic defense. I introduced the concept of identification with the aggressor. In doing so, I also outlined how the patient, in his positive identification with the analyst, forestalls any attack on the analyst, especially if the patient feels the analyst cannot sustain the attack. Most of these formulations required a two-person model, which brought the side of the problem to the early mother-child relationship. When Freud first read this paper, he found it, quote, harmless and stupid. As I mentioned, I found that the so-called objective, neutral, or indifferent stance of interpreting resistance and transference mobilized and reinforced the original trauma. I saw this position as and I called it an empathic failure, which made patients worse, causing them to leave treatment or rightfully rage against my unsympathetic position. I called this position professional hypocrisy. I discovered that when I examined my confusion and admitted to the patient that perhaps I was doing something wrong, the patients began to remember and talk more. I found that the patients were able to tell me more accurately what happened without having to fit their story into my preconceptions. I was accused of the crime of self-disclosure, but so be it. It helped the patients talk. For example, Elizabeth Severin, who herself was a therapist, convinced me to engage in mutual analysis, wherein she would analyze my countertransference. She knew I hated her despite my friendliness. When she finally got me to express my hatred for her, I braced myself. Allow me the modesty of quoting myself. The first torrent of the patient's affects, desire to die, notions of suicide, flight, is succeeded, quite remarkably, by relative composure and progress in the work. Curiously, this had a tranquilizing effect on the patient, who felt vindicated. However, I found mutual analysis with this severe and demanding patient untenable, and I stopped the practice. Most people misunderstood an important aspect of my discovery. I said that a curative factor was supplying the denied love that was needed for development, but I found that insufficient. However, establishing the positive mother transference did create an environment in which the patient felt safe in following the fundamental rule. And I suspect Winnicott liked that idea and termed it the holding environment. I also found that in supplying the positive empathic atmosphere, patients deepened their analysis. As I termed it, they got to rock bottom. And as modern analysts might put it, the patients were more inclined to say everything. Alexander, who also denounced me, based his corrective emotional experience on my practice. Also, I believe that my ideas parallel those of Spotnitz when he talks of the analytic countertransference.
So, in essence, a confusion of Tom's papers spelled out your use of countertransference and supplemented the Oedipus complex by moving the site of pathology to an earlier era, primarily between mother and child. With your invocation of identification, you offered an alternate to the prevalent drive theory, which set the stage for objects relations theory. You put aside interpretation and emphasized the concept of empathy, upon which self-psychology is based. And you conceptualized etiology and treatment with a two-person model. That's why you were called l'enfant terrible of psychoanalysis.
Wonderful pronunciation. What you say is absolutely correct. But it shortened my life and cast me into oblivion for many decades.
How so?
Well, I remember that on August 24, 1932, I met with Freud, who urged me not to publish The Confusion of Tongues. He was impatient and cold to me. When I extended my hand to say goodbye, he turned and left the room. I held my composure, but my wife, Gisela, dissolved in tears. It took me 9 months to dissolve. My official but undiagnosed illness was pernicious anemia, which is primarily due to vitamin B deficiency, but is also an autoimmune disease. I made my last clinical diary entry on October 2nd, 1932, gave up my practice, and became bedridden because of degeneration of my spinal cord. On March 29th, 1933, I wrote Freud. I advise you to take advantage of what time remains, since the situation is not imminently threatened, to leave for a more stable country. England, for example. Take some patience with you and your daughter Anna. Freud wrote on April 2nd, 1933, the differences between us can wait. It is now more important to me that you should recover your health. Despite this letter, my tenderness and passion vanished in the crucible of frustration and rage. My 60 years then lay in my coffin on May 23rd, 1933. I could no longer stand up against the establishment.